Okay, picture this. It's August 1765 in Boston. A mob forms, and they're headed for the mansion of Thomas Hutchinson, the Chief Justice of Massachusetts. And this isn't just a protest. This is a full-on demolition. They're smashing windows, they're tearing down walls, and they're either stealing or destroying everything the man owns. By the time they're done, there's basically nothing left but a hollowed-out shell.
So you have to ask, why? This wasn't just some random act of violence. This was the boiling point of a massive crisis, a crisis over what freedom really meant inside the British Empire. So what could possibly cause this level of rage? Well, the answer, believe it or not, comes down to a simple little piece of stamped paper.
To really get this, to understand that raw fury on the streets, we've got to look at the law that sparked it, and just as importantly, the people who decided they weren't going to take it.
This was the infamous Stamp Act. And for the colonies, this was a whole new kind of tax. See, this wasn't just a tax on goods coming in from overseas. This was a direct tax on their everyday lives. If you wanted to buy a newspaper, get a diploma, file a lawsuit, or heck, even play a game of cards, you had to buy a special stamp first. It touched pretty much any transaction that used paper.
And the guy leading this mob, he wasn't some wealthy politician. He was Ebenezer McIntosh, a local shoemaker and a veteran who had actually fought for the British Empire. And now he felt like that same empire was turning on him. He and his followers, the regular working folks of Boston, they became the muscle of the resistance, going after officials they thought were on the wrong side.
But why would Great Britain, literally the most powerful empire on the planet, risk this kind of chaos over a simple tax? Well, the answer is pretty simple. They had just won a massive global war, and they were broke.
For decades, Britain had this unofficial policy called salutary neglect. It basically meant they left the colonies alone to handle their own business. But the 7 Years' War, that changed absolutely everything. Suddenly, London wasn't seeing the colonies as partners anymore. No, they were subordinates, a source of cash that could help pay for their own defense and administration. And here is the number that drove all of this, £150 million. I mean, that is an astronomical amount of money for the 18th century. The debt was so bad that just the interest payments were eating up half the government's entire annual budget. So from London's perspective, it seemed totally fair to ask the American colonies to chip in for the cost of the empire that was protecting them.
Now, Britain had tried to raise money before and got some pushback, but the Stamp Act, that was different. It was like they crossed a line in the sand, and it turned a bunch of scattered complaints into a unified opposition that stretched across the entire continent.
And this is where you can really see that crucial difference. The Sugar Act from a year earlier, you could argue that was just Parliament regulating trade, which they'd always done. It mostly just hit merchants. But the Stamp Act was a direct internal tax. Its only purpose was to raise money, and it hit nearly everyone, from the richest lawyer to the poorest farmer.
And right here, this is the absolute heart of the matter. For generations, the colonists had operated under the belief that only their own elected representatives could tax them. The Stamp Act just tore that all up. It said that Parliament, an ocean away, could reach directly into their pockets. So this stopped being a debate about money and became a fight over power and fundamental rights.
So what started as a fight over a tax was really revealing a much deeper problem. It turns out the colonists and the British had two completely different and totally incompatible ideas about how the empire was even supposed to work.
And this clash really came down to two competing ideas. London's argument was something called virtual representation. The theory was that every member of parliament represented the entire empire, not just the district that elected him. So they said the colony's interests were already covered. The colonists, well, they weren't buying it. They believed in actual representation. And their rallying cry became famous: no taxation without representation.
And this is so important to get. This wasn't some radical new American idea they just invented. As Virginia's own assembly declared, the right to only be taxed by your own representatives was the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom. They weren't asking for new rights. They were fighting to keep the rights they believed they already had as Englishmen.
So, with this incredibly powerful idea as their rallying cry, how did the colonists manage to turn all this widespread anger into an organized, effective movement that could actually stand up to the might of the British Empire? Well, their strategy was actually pretty brilliant, and it hit on multiple fronts at once. They built a political network to share information, culminating in the Stamp Act Congress. They hit Britain where it hurt, in the wallet, by organizing a massive boycott of British goods. And on the ground, they used protest and pure intimidation to make it physically impossible to enforce the law. They were also masters of branding, The word liberty was everywhere. It became the slogan.
A big elm tree in Boston was named the Liberty Tree and became a literal meeting spot for the resistance. And you had these groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, organizing parades and protests, turning a complex legal argument into a cause that everyone could rally behind.
So, faced with this kind of united, effective, and frankly violent resistance, not to mention a lot of pressure from British merchants who were losing a ton of money from the boycotts, Parliament had a choice to make.
And in 1766, they folded. The Stamp Act was repealed. Celebrations broke out all over the colonies. It looked like a total victory for them. But there was a catch. On the very same day, Parliament quietly passed another law, one that was actually way more threatening, the Declaratory Act.
The Declaratory Act was basically Parliament's way of saying, all right, fine, you win this little battle, but don't you ever forget who's really in charge. It stated that Parliament had the power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So they got rid of the one tax, but they doubled down on their claim to absolute power, completely rejecting the colonists' main argument.
And it's really crucial to remember this. The fight against Britain was just one part of the story. Because within the colonies themselves, a whole other set of battles were brewing. Fights between the rich coastal elites and the poorer settlers in the backcountry over land, power, and who should rule at home. And a perfect example of this is the regulator movement down in the Carolinas. These were backcountry farmers who felt just as cheated and ignored by their own colonial governments as they did by Britain. They were protesting corrupt local officials and a system that gave all the power to the wealthy elite. Their demand for fair representation wasn't aimed at London. It was aimed right at their fellow colonists.
So, while the Stamp Act itself was gone, the actual conflict was now sharper and clearer than ever before. Britain had drawn a line in the sand, claiming total authority. And the colonists, they had learned an incredibly powerful lesson. When they stood together, they could make the world's biggest empire back down. The crisis of 1765 was over, but the American Revolution, well, it was just getting started.
You know, when we think about the American Revolution, it's easy to imagine it happening all at once. But the truth is, the 7 years between 1767 and 1774 were less of a slow drift and more of a rapid, out-of-control spiral. It was a series of rapid-fire actions and reactions that lit a fuse that just couldn't be put out. This is the story of that very escalation. So the big question is, right? How did it all fall apart that fast? I mean, how does a tax on something as simple as tea and what was basically a street brawl, how does that actually push an entire continent to war? Well, let's dive in and find out. All right, so let's set the scene. The year is 1767. The British government is still kind of smarting from the whole Stamp Act fiasco. That did not go well. So they think, okay, we need a better plan, a smarter way to get some money out of these colonies. To really get this, you've got to look at it from both sides, because they were seeing two completely different things. From Britain's point of view, the Townshend Acts were a pretty clever workaround. Instead of taxing colonists directly, they just taxed imported goods, things like tea, paper, glass. And the money they raised, it would go to pay the salaries of the royal governors, which would make them loyal to the crown, not the colonists. But the colonists, they saw something way more sinister. To them, this was still taxation without representation, and worse, it was a power grab. It was designed to cut the one financial string they had to control their own leaders. So, did the colonists just sit back and complain? No way. They got organized. And I mean really organized. They put together this incredibly sophisticated resistance that was designed to hit Britain exactly where it would hurt the most, right in the wallet. And what's so fascinating is how different groups all jump on board, but for totally different reasons. The boycott of British goods kicked off what they called the homespun virtue movement. You had women, these daughters of liberty, who started weaving their own cloth, making it a huge public statement of resistance. Then you had the rich planters in the Chesapeake, who were, frankly, deep in debt to British merchants. For them, hey, this was a great excuse to stop buying stuff and save some cash. And the city artisans, they loved it. It was the perfect way to get rid of their British competition. So you see, it wasn't just this high-minded political thing. It was this powerful social and economic movement all rolled into one. So you've got this economic pressure building up, right? Well, at the same time, the military pressure starts to ratchet up too. And that combination, absolutely explosive. It's what turns a simple street scuffle into this massive symbol of tyranny. So to make sure these new laws were followed and to crack down on all the smuggling, Britain sends soldiers, redcoats, right into Boston. And this was like tossing a lit match into a room full of gunpowder. because these soldiers weren't just marching around. When they were off duty, they were taking jobs on the waterfront, competing directly with the locals. You can just imagine the friction, the tension just simmering in that city. And on March 5th, 1770, that simmering tension just boiled over. It starts with a crowd gathering, taunting a handful of British soldiers. They're throwing snowballs, yelling insults, just chaos. And in moments, it escalates. It completely spins out of control. The soldiers, probably feeling trapped and threatened, they open fire. And when the smoke clears, 5 Bostonians are dead on the street. One of them, Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed race, a former slave. He goes down in history as the very first martyr of the American Revolution. But you know what actually happened that night? Almost didn't matter. What mattered was the story that was told about it. Immediately, it wasn't a riot or a chaotic brawl. It was branded a massacre. And you get this incredible propaganda, like Paul Revere's famous engraving. It doesn't show a chaotic scene. It shows an organized line of soldiers firing on a peaceful, helpless crowd. A calculated execution. And that became the story everyone believed. It was this incredibly powerful image of British tyranny that just spread like wildfire through the colonies. Okay, so after the massacre, and with all that economic pressure, Britain actually backs down a bit. They repeal most of the Townshend taxes, they pull the troops out of Boston, and things kind of calm down. A fragile peace settles in. But, and this is a huge but, they left one tax, just one, the tax on tea. And that one little tax, it was about to become the fuse for an even bigger explosion. Fast forward to 1773. The East India Company, which was this massive politically connected corporation, was about to go bankrupt. So to save it, Parliament passes the Tea Act. Now listen, this is key. This was not a new tax. You got to think of it like a corporate bailout. The plan was simple. Step 1, help the company. Step 2, give it a total monopoly to sell its tea in America. Step 3, let it dump tons of super cheap tea on the market, undercutting everybody. But here's the catch. Step 4, they kept that small, hated Townshend tax on it. And that right there, that was the trap. For the colonists, this was never, ever about the price of tea. In fact, the tea was now cheaper than it had ever been, even cheaper than the smuggled stuff. But buying it meant you were paying the tax, and paying the tax meant you were agreeing, you were accepting that Parliament had the right to tax you without your say. It was a line in the sand, it was about the principle, and they were not going to cross it. So what did they do? The response was, well, it was theatrical. It was defiant. In December of 1773, a bunch of colonists, dressed up as Native Americans, snuck aboard 3 ships in Boston Harbor, and they proceeded to dump over 300 chests of tea straight into the water. We're talking about a massive act of protest that cost the East India Company, get this, the equivalent of about $4 million in today's money. A huge financial blow. So if the Boston Massacre made Britain angry, the Boston Tea Party made them absolutely furious. In their eyes, this wasn't protest, it was the destruction of private property. It was anarchy. And their response was going to be swift, it was going to be harsh, and it was designed to make a brutal example out of Massachusetts. So Parliament fires back with a package of laws that the colonists immediately start calling the Intolerable Acts. And they were. This was a coordinated smackdown. First, the Port Act. Boston's harbor is completely closed until every last bit of that tea is paid for. The entire city's economy shut down. Then the Government Act. They basically gutted local democracy, severely limiting town meetings. And finally, a new Quartering Act, which let soldiers be housed in private homes. The message from London could not have been clearer. Submit, or we will crush you. And as if that wasn't enough, at the very same time, Parliament passes something called the Quebec Act. Now, this extended Canada's border down into the Ohio Valley, which totally blocked the westward expansion plans of colonies like Virginia. And it granted legal toleration to Catholics. Now, for the colonists, who were overwhelmingly Protestant, this felt like a full-blown conspiracy. They felt like they were being boxed in, squeezed by political tyranny from the east and now what they saw as religious tyranny from the north and west. But here's the thing. Parliament's whole strategy? It backfired. Spectacularly. The goal was to isolate Massachusetts, to make them an example. But instead, these intolerable acts did the exact opposite. They unified the colonies. Everyone looked at what was happening to Boston and thought, that could be us next. The threat from London wasn't some abstract idea anymore. It was real. It was here. And it was pointed at all of them. And so, here we are, the breaking point. That whole cycle that started with what they thought was a smarter tax had just spun completely and totally out of control.
Let's just stop and think about this for a second. How on earth do you go from being a proud British subject to declaring all-out war on your own king in just 2 years? It's one of the most incredible, fastest political turnarounds in all of history. So today, we're going to break down exactly how that happened, how colonial protest caught fire and became a full-blown revolution between 1774 and 1776.
We have all heard this line. It's iconic, right? But here is the major twist. When Patrick Henry shouted this in 1775, he wasn't asking for a new country, not at all. He was demanding his rights as a British citizen. You see, that was the key mindset back then. The goal wasn't to cut ties with the empire, but to fix their place within it. So, what's the very first step in a massive shift like that? Well, it's not war, it's not even protest. It's unity. Before the colonies could even dream of fighting the British Empire, they first had to stop thinking of themselves as 13 little separate entities and start acting as one.
So in 1774, the First Continental Congress meets. But you gotta understand, this was way more than just a meeting of important guys. By doing things like adopting the Suffolk Resolves, which basically told people to boycott British goods and just ignore British law, they were creating a shadow government. They were literally systematically shifting power away from the crown and putting it right into the hands of local colonists.
And their most powerful weapon? It wasn't a gun. It was the Continental Association. This thing was a massive, coordinated economic boycott. The strategy was pretty simple, really. Hurt Britain's wallet until they were forced to listen. This was all about collective, nonviolent resistance.
And get this wasn't just a handful of elites in Philadelphia making decisions. By 1775, you had 7,000 ordinary men. We're talking farmers, merchants, regular guys who had never held any kind of office, serving on local committees to enforce this boycott. It just shows you this was a true grassroots movement building from the ground up.
Political unity was one thing, but events on the ground were escalating, and fast. By the time the Second Continental Congress got together in May of 1775, the time for boycotts and polite petitions was long gone. War had already started.
And the situation just exploded. In April of 75, you have the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord. Just 1 month later, Fort Ticonderoga gets captured. And by June, you have the brutal, bloody Battle of Bunker Hill. We're talking about a span of just a few weeks where this thing went from a protest to all-out war. There was absolutely no going back. So, to face this new reality, the Second Continental Congress made a huge move. They created the Continental Army and, of course, put George Washington in charge. This was a total game changer. It meant this was no longer just a bunch of local militias running around. This was now one unified American army fighting for a single American cause.
But even with a new army and a war already underway, the biggest battle was still yet to come. And it wasn't going to be fought on any battlefield. It was going to be fought in the minds of the colonists themselves. The idea of completely breaking away from Great Britain, well, it was still a terrifying thought for so many people.
Which brings up a really strange contradiction, doesn't it? I mean, they are literally at war with British soldiers. People are dying. So why not just declare independence already? Answering that question, well, it reveals the deep fear and conflict that was right at the heart of this entire movement.
You see, this wasn't about being cowardly. It was about being pragmatic. You have to remember, most colonists were proud to be part of the most powerful empire on Earth. They were worried that breaking away would just lead to total chaos, maybe even a civil war between the colonies themselves. To them, the danger of anarchy seemed way, way worse than the tyranny of a king who was thousands of miles away.
And you could see this division clear as day inside the Continental Congress. On one side, you had leaders from places like Massachusetts and Virginia. They'd felt the harshest effects of British policies, and they were pushing hard for a break. But on the other side, you had delegates from really diverse colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, who were absolutely terrified that independence would cause their own societies to just tear themselves apart.
Then came a tipping point, especially for the South. In late 1775, Virginia's British governor, Lord Dunmore, made a proclamation. He offered freedom to any enslaved person who fled their owner and came to fight for the crown. Now, to the Southern planter class, whose entire economy and social order was built on slavery, this wasn't just a military tactic. It was an existential threat, and it pushed a lot of them off the fence and firmly into the independence camp.
So the colonies are stuck, right? They're caught in this limbo between loyalty and rebellion. They're at war, but they're not even totally sure what they're fighting for yet.
What they needed was a powerful news story, a clear, compelling argument for why breaking away was the only real option they had left.
I mean, just think about how absurd the situation was. They were at war with the king's army, yet many of them were still sending letters pleading for their rights as the king's loyal subjects. It made absolutely no sense. And into this confusion steps a man named Thomas Paine, armed with a simple pamphlet that was about to change everything.
Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, was like a lightning bolt. He didn't just list a few complaints. He took a sledgehammer to the entire idea of British rule. He called monarchy a fraud. He said it was completely absurd for a tiny island to rule a whole continent. And he argued the empire was a burden, just dragging America into Europe's endless wars. And the best part? He wrote it in plain, simple language that everybody could understand, and it spread like wildfire.
So Common Sense basically broke the psychological dam. It gave colonists the intellectual permission they needed to finally embrace the radical idea of independence. The last step was to make it official, and to define exactly what this new nation was going to stand for.
Okay, here's a great piece of trivia for you. Congress actually voted for independence on July 2nd. In fact, John Adams thought that would be the day we'd celebrate with fireworks. But it was on July 4th that they approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence, the actual document that explained their reasoning to the entire world.
Now, most of the Declaration is actually this long list of complaints against King George. But its real power, the part that truly changed the world, is right there in the preamble. These ideas became the new nation's mission statement. All men are created equal. Governments get their power from the people, and if a government stinks, the people have the right to start over. For 1776, this was an absolutely revolutionary concept. And this right here might be the single most important idea to come out of the entire revolution. The fight was no longer about the specific rights of Englishmen, these little privileges that were tied to one specific country. No, it was now about the rights of mankind, universal rights that belong to everyone, everywhere, just because you're human. They took liberty from being a local perk and turned it into a universal ideal.
And that universal vision is what gave birth to this whole idea of American exceptionalism. You see, the founders didn't just see this new nation as a place for themselves. They saw it as a refuge from tyranny for everyone, a global symbol of freedom, what Thomas Paine so perfectly called an asylum for mankind.
And that's really the final thought to leave you with. By writing the Declaration not just for the king, but for the opinions of mankind, for the whole world to read, the founders created a script for freedom, a script that has been used by independence movements all around the globe, even to this very day. They somehow managed to turn a local fight over taxes into a timeless, universal argument for human rights.
So let's talk about one of the greatest underdog stories in all of history, the American Revolution. It's the story of how a scrappy, disorganized group of colonists went up against the biggest, baddest empire on the planet and somehow managed to win. And that's the big question, right? How on earth did they pull it off? How did a collection of colonies with a volunteer army defeat the global superpower of the day? To really get it, you first have to understand just how completely stacked the odds were against them. I mean, just look at this matchup. It's almost laughable, right? On one side, you have Great Britain. They've got the most powerful navy in the world, a professional, well-trained army, experienced generals, and they even hired German mercenaries for backup. And the American colonies? They had, well, no navy at all. Their army was mostly inexperienced militias, and they were almost always short on guns, food, and supplies. On paper, this shouldn't have been a war. It should have been a quick smackdown. So yeah, it really was a classic David versus Goliath story. And that's exactly what we're going to dig into first, just how lopsided this whole thing was from the very beginning. But you know, what you can't see on paper are the things that really matter. The Americans had these intangible advantages. They were fighting for an incredibly powerful cause, their own freedom. This wasn't some distant conflict for them. This was their home, their land. They knew the terrain like the back of their hand, and a good number of them had actually gotten combat experience fighting in the 7 Years' War. They had everything to lose. Now, the British, on the other hand, made a whole series of, honestly, arrogant mistakes. They completely underestimated the colonist spirit. They just couldn't believe that these farmers would actually stand and fight. They totally misjudged how popular the idea of independence was, and they never really wrapped their heads around the colossal challenge of trying to conquer and occupy 13 colonies across an entire ocean. And, maybe most importantly, they didn't count on their own people getting sick and tired of paying the bills for a long, bloody war. And all those miscalculations by the British, they were crucial, because the early years of this war were, well, they were an absolute disaster for the Americans. This next part is all about survival and surprise, with George Washington just desperately trying to keep the dream of revolution from dying out completely. I mean, you can't overstate how bad 1776 was for the American cause. The British Army rolls into New York City, and Washington gets routed, forced into this humiliating retreat where he loses 3,000 men as prisoners. By the time winter hit, his army had practically evaporated, shrinking from about 28,000 soldiers down to just 3,000. Why? Because enlistments were up and men were just discouraged and walking home. And the human cost of this thing, it's just staggering. Think about this number for a second. 1 out of every 20 free men between 16 and 45 died in this war. To put that in perspective, that's a bigger slice of the population than America lost in the Civil War or World War II. It shows you the incredible level of sacrifice that was being demanded. So, with the army just falling apart, a huge question comes up. Who's actually going to fight this war? And at first, George Washington, who was a slave owner himself, flat out refused to allow black men to enlist in the Continental Army. But, well, reality hit. The British made a very clever, very strategic move. Virginia's royal governor promised freedom to any enslaved person who would fight for the crown. This move created a huge problem for the Patriots, and it pretty much forced Washington to change his mind. In the end, about 5,000 black soldiers would fight for the cause of American independence. So, with the revolution basically on life support, Washington knew he needed more than just a win. He needed a miracle. And what he came up with was one of the biggest gambles in military history, a surprise attack on Christmas night in 1776. He led his freezing, starving troops across the icy Delaware River and completely surprised the Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. It was a shocking victory, and it breathed just enough life back into the cause to keep it going. Now, that victory at Trenton, it was a huge shot in the arm. But the real game changer, the moment that flipped the entire world on its head, that was still to come. This is how a single battle managed to change absolutely everything. Okay, so the British come up with this plan that, on paper, looks pretty brilliant. They're going to send an army down from Canada to meet up with their forces in New York City, which would slice the colonies in two. But here's the fatal blunder. The general in New York, a guy named Howe, just decides to go and attack Philadelphia instead. He leaves the other British general, Burgoyne, totally isolated and vulnerable way up in upstate New York. And that mistake? That's what opened the door for the Americans. This is what we call the Saratoga effect, and it was a chain reaction. First, the American forces surround Burgoyne's stranded army and force them to surrender. This incredible victory proves to the rest of the world, especially France, that hey, these Americans might actually win this thing. That's all Benjamin Franklin needed. He secures a formal military alliance with France. And just like that, this isn't a colonial rebellion anymore. It's now a global war. So, after that shocking defeat at Saratoga, the British had to completely rethink their strategy. They decided to gamble on the South, thinking they had more loyalist support down there. This kicked off the final and, frankly, the most brutal phase of the entire war. You would think after a win like Saratoga, morale would be sky high, right? Well, for a while it was, but the war just dragged on. And by 1780, with the fighting stuck in this ugly guerrilla war in the South, American morale had absolutely hit rock bottom. It really felt like the whole revolution was about to fall apart. I mean, 1770 was just one piece of bad news after another. It was a total crisis. Congress was broke, the army hadn't been paid for months, the British captured Charleston, and with it, 5,000 American prisoners. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough, one of Washington's best generals, Benedict Arnold, betrayed them. With soldiers starving and unpaid, mutinies started breaking out. It was the lowest point of the entire war. So how? How do you come back from that? How do you win a war that seems absolutely impossible? That's what we're talking about in our final section, the final victory, and what it took to get there. Okay, so here is a wild fact that I think gets lost in the shuffle a lot of the time. When we get to the final decisive battle, Yorktown, look at who's actually there. You've got more French forces on the ground than American forces. That alliance that was secured after Saratoga, it was about to pay off in a huge way. And that right there, that was the final checkmate. The British General Cornwallis had moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, right on the coast, thinking the British Navy could resupply him or pull him out if needed. Big mistake. A French fleet sailed in and blockaded the coast, cutting off his only escape route. On land, he was completely surrounded by the combined American and French armies. He was trapped. He had no choice but to surrender. The surrender at Yorktown was basically the end of the line for the fighting. Support for the war back in Britain just completely collapsed. A couple of years later, you get the Treaty of Paris, which made it all official. The war was over, and Great Britain formally recognized the United States as an independent nation. So, when you pull it all together, how was this impossible war actually won? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was this perfect storm of American advantages, like fighting for a cause on home turf with Washington's incredible leadership, and those critical British miscalculations, like underestimating their opponent. But the one ingredient that you absolutely cannot forget is the crucial military aid from France. Without it, the war almost certainly would not have been won. And just like that, the war was over. Independence was won. An incredible achievement. But you know, winning a war, that's one thing. Winning the peace is something else entirely. And the victory left this one huge lingering question. Could these 13 very different, very rival colonies ever really become one single nation?